The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Once that was lost. It is given to us now to remember it. It began with the finding of the Red Book. The year was 1923 of the Common Era. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was a professor of linguistics at Pembroke College when he discovered the Red Book beneath the halls of Oxford. It would be another 12 years before he attained sufficient mastery of the language of Westron, and another 2 before he published There and Back Again, an ancient epic authored by Bilbo Labingi. Over the years, the world came to know the history of Middle-earth, a land more magical than we had ever imagined. Due to the work of Tolkien, we regained knowledge of forgotten ages. But there was more to this story. In January 2019, in Southgate, North London, another discovery was made. Dr. Charles Michelson, Associate Professor of Middle-earth Studies at Doast University, was consulting on the excavation of Bag End. There, on the morning of the 18th of January, archaeologists unearthed heretofore unknown fragments of the Red Book.
I hadn't been on site long when we found the study. And almost immediately we found the portrait, and I mean, that was incredible. Really just a groundbreaking discovery. Finally, we didn't just have physical descriptions in the text to tell us what these figures looked like. We had an actual commissioned portrait of Bilbo Labingi himself from around the time of his adventure with Thorin's company. It was incredible. I couldn't imagine then what we'd find next. The fragments are truly amazing. They fit into the texts we have, into the Red Book, so seamlessly. It's a wonder they were ever removed in the first place. You have to ask, what editor made that decision? Was it some Middle-earth era revisionist? A later scribe with their own agenda? Was it human error? Or could it be more recent? We don't know. So my question became, what are in these fragments that someone would want to hide? I've always loved Middle-earth. Ever since I was a child, I wanted to know more about this part of our past. To be at the Bag End site, every day you're finding bowls, you're finding portraits, trinkets, these things that are so familiar to us, and yet it's like they're out of another world. Little by little, the stories start to come to life before your eyes. And then the fragments. I'll never forget when I first got my hands on them. I'm translating this text, and as I'm reading it, it was just one of those moments where you stop and you realize this is going to change the world. The Southgate fragments are, they're everything. Tolkien's Red Book of the Fairynath was an incomplete manuscript. These fragments contain so much, not in page number, but more in what they tell us about the peoples of Middle-earth, about the kind of lives they led. The fragments reveal previously unknown diversity in the areas of sexuality and gender identity. The wealth of information in such a small amount of text is incredible.
The longest fragment is about the House of Stewards in Minas Tirith, and fits seamlessly into Tolkien's Appendix A, Annals of the Kings and Rulers. So,
in the year 3007 of the Third Age, the brothers Faramir and Boromir organized the first gay pride march in Minas Tirith. In response, their father, Steward Denethor II, arranges the first straight pride march just 1 month later. As we see from the fragment, this march is very poorly attended. It's Denethor and the guards of the Citadel, and briefly Faramir. who we read only attends out of familial obligation and only long enough for his presence to be noted. The fragment later tells us that Denethor declined to make his march an annual event, as he remarked it was not worth being in such close proximity to his son. In this way, Faramir showed both his courage and wisdom, playing on his father's resentment toward him to ensure this first parade was the last. So Faramir and Boromir are hugely supportive of the LGBTQ community in Gondor, and in fact, their support lays the groundwork for King Elessar, also known as Aragorn, to make the reunited kingdom a haven for all LGBTQ folk. What's most remarkable about this text is that all instances of the term LGBTQ is original to the Westron. We previously accepted that this acronym was created in the 1980s. We now know it's older than the English language itself. So we have to ask, when did we lose this terminology, this widespread social acceptance that Gondor achieved? Further research is needed to answer these questions. So this first fragment tells us that Faramir and Boromir were very publicly involved in advancing LGBTQ rights in Gondor, but what about the brothers' personal involvement? Now, the evidence suggests that both brothers were indeed straight. Boromir was a well-known patron of a number of queer establishments in the city. In fact, at least one lesbian tavern was named in his honor. We know from the first fragment that Faramir was instrumental in bringing gender confirmation medicine to the Houses of Healing, but a later shorter fragment by his son Elrond reveals that Faramir was himself trans. Perhaps this offers insight into how Faramir got his name. After all, scholars have long wondered why Denethor would be so blatant in his favoring Boromir over Faramir, even down to what he called them. Boromir, we know, means brilliant jewel in Sindarin, whereas Faramir means only sufficient jewel. Now we know that this preference for Boromir is at least possibly rooted in the Stewards' transphobia. This prejudice also explains Denethor's dislike of Gandalf. After all, Gandalf is responsible for introducing gender confirmation medicine to Gondor.
Other fragments can be categorized by race, providing insight into how different groups in Middle-earth related to sexuality and gender identity.
First of all, I think it's important to address the usage of race-based terminology in Middle-earth studies. To talk of quote-unquote races in Middle-earth is problematic for two reasons. One, because the pseudoscience of race theory has long been disproven, and two, because the peoples of Middle-earth weren't subsets of the same human species. They weren't all Homo sapiens. They were all distinct hominin species. The Ostia discovery of Minas Tirith in 2014, and the subsequent discovery of its tombs, and in particular those of Aragorn's royal line, taught us that certain species like Homo sapiens and Homo acris, or elves as Tolkien translates, were capable of producing viable offspring. Other species, like Homo lepidus, dwarves, were too genetically distinct to interbreed, which almost certainly contributed to its gradual extinction. Homo floresiensis, or hobbits, survived longest alongside our own ancestors until around 50,000 years ago. Anyway, I'm far outside my area of expertise. The point is, race is a questionable term here, but I will use the Tolkien glosses going forward for the sake of comprehension. Okay, so the Fellowship. The Fellowship of the Ring is really a microcosm of Middle-earth queerness. Each of these 9 individuals typify their own races, and on top of that, the Southgate fragments reveal that a number of members were, in fact, coupled romantically, again in ways typical to their respective cultures. For example, Mora and Banazir. A fragment from Two Towers demonstrates Ban's clear romantic love for Mora. In this he says, "I love him romantically. I am bisexual." You can't get much clearer than that. In Return of the King, another fragment reveals that Mora and Ban entered into a polycule with Rúza Lothrin. Mora says, "We shall all get married. What a home we shall make together." As this polycule suggests, Hobbitish society was generally sex-positive, and Hobbitish families were often blended. Speaking of the Fellowship, It's also worth noting that Razanor Took and Calamak Brandagamba were both trans men. This discovery was especially surprising. Many scholars have, over the years, observed the queer subtext in Mora and Ban's relationship, but there's no mention in either the Tolkien translation or the Southgate fragments of Raz or Cal's transness. It was instead in the Ostia discovery, when archaeologists unearthed the bodies of two Homo florensis specimens buried next to Aragorn, that we realized they were trans. Because their gender identity is mentioned nowhere in the text, we can infer that Hobbitish society was accepting of trans hobbits, assisting and celebrating their full social transition. Another obvious coupling is Legolas and Gimli. Conservative guesses place their initial coupling around the time of Aragorn's coronation, but there are some hints that it could have begun as early as the Battle of the Hornburg. Prior to the coronation, the Sindarin term of endearment Legolas and Gimli use for one another is Melpen, an otherwise unattested portmanteau meaning loved one. After the coronation, this switches permanently to Meleth, or simply lover. So obviously, they were coupled then. And coupling, that is the physical consummation, is itself the act of marriage in Elven culture. So Legolas and Gimli weren't just in love, they were married. This is, of course, the only surviving example we have of a romantic relationship between an elf and a dwarf, so we must wonder, how was such a marriage received? It seems telling that neither Legolas nor Gimli ever resettled in their land of origin. Did Mirkwood and Erebor disapprove of their union? We know on a biological basis that dwarves could not interbreed with other races, but intermarriage is not the same thing, particularly in dwarven society where same-sex marriage was so common. Children were celebrated but not expected from dwarven pairings. We've known for decades about the low birth rate among dwarves, but for a long time scholars assumed this was due to a gender imbalance in dwarven society. Pre-Potsdam estimates assumed one dwarf female for every 3 to 5 dwarf males. However, the Potsdam discovery of Erebor in 2017 revealed a virtually equal distribution of male and female dwarves. Instead, the Southgate fragments suggest that dwarves were overwhelmingly homosexual. This, along with the lack of societal pressure to produce children, explains the consistently low birth rate, as well as the dwarves' eventual extinction. So we don't see a negative dwarven response to intermarriage, though we don't see a positive one either. The same can be said for elves. Both dwarven and elven society were remarkably egalitarian, but for different reasons. Dwarves had no discernible gender norms, and as we know, males and females even shared beards as a secondary sexual characteristic. Elves, on the other hand, were gender fluid. We find that elves could change their physical form in accordance with their gender identity, which shifted freely along with their sexuality until marriage. We can only assume that this fluidity extended indefinitely for unmarried elves, though most married relatively young. An exception to this is Elrond Perithel, who wed Celebrian at age 3608. Upon marrying, Elrond chose to live as a straight cis male, though rumors of his bisexuality persist to this day. You've read Elrond Perithel, The Complete History. But you've heard about it, right? It was a New York Times bestseller in 1995. Anyway, McElbrian publishes this ridiculous, unfounded narrative saying that Elrond and Celebrian were both bisexual and had threesomes, foursomes, whatever, with elves of all genders. And you know what? No. We know what elven marriage is. The consummation was, no, sex is marriage in elven culture. When elves wed, they wed for life, and there is no evidence of polygamy. We can reject McElbrian's outrageous claim. There is also a Second Age fragment of the Noldorin king Gilgalad calling Elrond Melith or lover, but there's no record of them being married. It was clearly a scribal error, like it was nothing. Yes, I'm fine. So as it turns out, Boromir is the only straight member of the Fellowship. Aragorn was probably bi. There's not much that we can tell from his fragments because they are the most fragmented. In Two Towers and Return of the King, we see him refer to Theoden King as Eor Melith, another portmanteau meaning old lover. So this suggests a past romantic relationship between the two kings. Fascinating, right? Because Aragorn uses this phrase with Theoden from their earliest interactions in Two Towers, their coupling most likely occurred when Aragorn served Theoden King's father Thengel between 2957 and 2969 under the pseudonym Thorongil. But obviously Aragorn married Arwen, so bisexuality is likely. While we're touching on Theoden, though, I do want to mention a fragment about Éowyn. We know Rohan has shield maidens, but Rohirric society was still fairly gendered. Despite these strict gender roles, Éowyn moved freely between femininity and masculinity, and like Faramir, Éowyn was trans. Somewhere in her teen years, she begins styling herself the Lady of Rohan. Her uncle Theoden and brother Éomer had their doubts about her gender, as did all the people of Edoras, but they respected her name and title out of love for Theoden's line. It was only when she slayed the Witch King, who no living man could kill, that all of Rohan embraced her as Éowyn, Lady of the Shield Arm and Daughter of Kings. So we've covered the rest of the Fellowship by now. But what of Gandalf? As we know from the Stewards fragment, Gandalf was instrumental in bringing gender confirmation medicine to Gondor. Gandalf is a Maya, he's one of the Astari. It's natural that he'd know a lot about gender identity. The final Southgate fragment comes from the Ainulindale, located in Tolkien's Silmarillion. It describes the Valar as agender and gender fluid. This is, interestingly, the exact opposite of what we see in Tolkien's translation, where the Valar do have an innate gender that is immutable. How can we reconcile such a blatant contradiction?
Middle-earth studies remains a fairly young field, and it would not exist without the pioneering scholarship of J.R.R. Tolkien. The world owes an enormous debt to his linguistic and historiographical scholarship. However, so overwhelming is the evidence that Middle-earth was largely welcoming of LGBTQ folk that we must ask, was Tolkien truly unaware of this phenomenon, as its absence in his work suggests? Or did he choose to obscure it? Even more concerning is the apparent alteration made to Tolkien's Ainulindale.
I don't want to accuse Tolkien of concealing anything. That's really not what I'm trying to do here. I have contacted the Tolkien Estate. I've tried to give them the chance to get ahead of this, to prove once and for all that Tolkien's Red Book never contained these fragments, that he's never hidden any knowledge about Middle-earth. They haven't gotten back to me, the Estate. I don't expect them to. Overall, I'm grateful to know what we know. For elves, dwarves, hobbits, trans and queer individuals were a celebrated fact of life, and same-sex marriage was so common that there's little point in differentiating between gay marriage and straight marriage. It was simply marriage. It's only in certain societies, in Rohan and Gondor in particular, where we see prejudice or legal restrictions, and even then we see great progress by the time of the War of the Ring, with Faramir and Boromir's advancement of LGBTQ rights, with Aragorn's continuation of that with Éowyn. And for humans in places like Bree and Dale, where they lived in such close proximity to hobbits and elves and dwarves, they were much more accepting. So in the end, what can we learn from the Southgate Discovery? I mean, that's what we've been doing this entire time, but what can it teach us today? The fragments open a window to a time so long ago, where people so similar to us enjoyed for hundreds of years, for millennia, what we in the modern age have fought decades to achieve, are still fighting to achieve today. How can we reclaim this ancient acceptance, respect, and love for our fellow human being? How do we nurture a similar spirit of mutual support to help everyone reach their full potential, to live into their truth, to be who they were meant to be? These fragments are lessons whispering to us. What are they saying to you?
So I think Sam and Frodo should have kissed. And my feeling about that is that, Rachel said to say that, to tell you that, with a sort of kidding. But why? What? First of all, how do you know they didn't? You know what I mean? It's a long trek to Mordor. We loved the gay fan fiction when it came out. When it came out, like coming out of the closet. Oh my gosh. Anyhow, our instinct when the movie came out was just to love that fans embraced the movie and the characters, and so whatever people want to conceptualize for them is fine with us.